The protocol archive smelled, quite reasonably, of old paper and something that could have been called regret had regret been a scent with a catalogue entry. Shelves rose and tilted like the spines of sleeping whales. Their titles were stamped in fonts that had gone extinct when languages were still finding their accents. A single lamp burned on a metal desk where Gideon Furl sat like a man guarding his last clean log file. Around him the team spread like wayward clauses, Rita with her binder open as if it might be a shield. Arya standing by a stack of policy memos with her red pen ready for ritual bloodletting. Clara with a tin of biscuits, which always seemed to provide freshness no regulation could cultivate. Mr. Enoch leaning on his mop as though it were a staff carved from patient centuries, Azra vibrating slightly, like a coat hung in a breeze. Tom folding and unfolding a small notebook with fingers that worked through memory as if untying knots. Norman in the middle, margin scarred and oddly at the center of the page the room had become. They had come back to the archive because the archive was where questions went to be made respectable. You could not petition the heavens without the proper call numbers. You could not invoke precedent without footnotes. It was, in short, where a bureaucratic soul could hide a prayer in plain sight. Gideon had been right in the irritatingly pedantic way Gideon was right. The answer would not be in the big brass, embossed volumes on the upper shelves. The high tums were good at affirmations and well-worn authority. They were poor at remembering the half-measures and hesitations of the clerks who had gripped pens in panic during the Ash years. Gideon, who trusted nothing he could not pass into a log, had been following an odd thread in an index whose pages smelled newly of someone else's tears and last week's coffee. The thread had led them down and then down again, to a ledger that was more ledgerous than the ledgers above its cover was the color of a long-forgotten apology. When Gideon opened it, the pages sighed. Marginalia had colonized the margins. Earlier readers had written small pleas, frantic exasperations, doodles of impossible seals. It was, in a way, a history of hesitations, where prior clerks had stopped because the machine of policy insisted, and where they had scrawled, in tiny, desperate letters, "Consider mercy." Norman felt a small and ridiculous flush of triumph when he found the amendment. It was a footnote folded into itself, a footnote with a footnote. The page caught the light so that the ink seemed to be winking at him like a conspiratorial accountant. Curative exceptions may be considered when accompanied by irrefutable human testimony and an appeal from a non-departmental authority. Norman read aloud. Because reading aloud is how written things become real in a room full of people who had spent their lives making things official. He kept his voice level, but his hand was not. Non-departmental authority, Rita murmured. Her finger hooked around the clause as if it were a lifeline. Arbitrary as it sounds, Gideon said, pushing up his glasses with a neat, nervous motion that suggested glasses might be the only literal thing he trusted in a world where metaphors often altered the truth. But it is, technically, not arbitrary. It's a loophole nested in a precedent. Someone codified the possibility that procedure might occasionally need compassion. Remarkable in a clinical sort of way. Remarkable and terrifying, Arya said. She had come forward now, the red pen dangling from her lapel like a knife she had never learned to sheath. If precedent is set for exceptions, Primus will. She did not finish. Auditor Primus was a presence felt in the air of that basement, as though the archives themselves were watching to see what would happen to their carefully arranged certainties. Primus would prefer not to be made obsolete by indecision, Tom said, smiling in that way of his that was good at making mischief look like malice. He handed a small leather notebook across the table with a flintet of apology. There's more. Everyone looked at Tom, because Tom had a way of being the one who threw the switch and then pretended not to have known what would happen when the lights came on. He had worked as a junior auditor in the Celestial Division, and he had quit carrying with him a habit of crossing things out. He had, once upon a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, suppressed a prophecy. You did what? Norman said, which was both a question and a squeak. Tom thumbed the notebook open. The handwriting inside was neat in a way that made Norman feel ashamed of his own margins. The lines were a prophecy in miniature, a small village, a midwife, a decision made too neatly. I made it go quiet. I redacted. I thought he stopped. The room had the sudden hush of a recessed universe, pages holding their breath. Why? Norman asked. Tom's smile thinned. Because at the time it looked like simplifying the system would prevent panic. Because I was young and believed in tidy endings. Because I was afraid an ugly truth would give people an excuse to be violent in the name of closure. Because I was cowardly. Because I thought I could make the world easier. And what did it do? Norman's question had more steam in it than had intended. It made me complicit in a smaller suffering, Tom said. People who needed a warning didn't get one. People who needed to know were left to find out later, when it was messy and loud and terrible. I told myself that I had prevented a riot. Instead, I made something that festered. The confession sat on the table like a new, unwieldy policy memo. It made the air taste what a filing error tasted like. Copper and alarm. Tom, Rita said softly, because she had been an organizer for so long that she could hear the logic in a man's contrition. If your testimony helps people, then it is testimony we must use. The union does not judge the past. We act for the living. Norman, who had for weeks measured his worth in the arcs of forms and the smoothness of stapling, felt his principles undergoing a small, clumsy hurricane. All those hours in which he had insisted on the straight edge of paperwork had been, in part, defense against the wildness of human sorrow, against the possibility that a single misaligned stamp could tumble the world. Now the same neatness that had comforted him might bury the messy things that made life worth saving. So that's the thing, isn't it? Norman said. His voice surprised him, as if speaking made his insides line up in new ways. The clause doesn't ask us to pretend nothing happened. It asks for testimony. For humans to say what happened and why it mattered. They want people to tell their messy truths. Area will have trouble with that, Clara said. She popped a biscuit and the sound was a small domestic drumroll. Institutional memory is about absolutes. Your margin scribbles are their anxiety. Institutions are built to prevent entropy, Area said. Primus will argue that exceptions beget erosion. If we allow this, others will come with pleas, and we will be unmoored. The problem with compassion is that it is contagious. And yet not allowing it kills people in small, bureaucratic ways, Mr. Knox said. His voice was always soft, as if he swept language along with the floor. We don't measure those deaths in auditable units. Azra made a small sound, a flicker of laughter or a scented exhale. You have the option of a metaphysical affidavit. Think of it as a sympathetic signature, a thing that testifies to the authenticity of experience. It will not replace testimony from the living nothing should, but it can lend weight that the directorate respects. Azra's fingers, when they moved, left faint, glittering threads in the air that evaporated like forgotten receipts. What is the catch? Rita asked. You treat assistants too well. Azra smiled in such a way that it wasn't clear whether Azra was pleased or warning. The affidavit answers certain questions about perception and veracity. It will bind the teller's memory to their account. That has advantages when skepticism is high. But it can also make a memory unchangeable. People who might have been able to revise their accounts in light of new compassion could end up stuck with the wording of their moment. So it converts a living, breathing testimony into something archival, Gideon said. He sounded fascinated and nervous at once. It compresses the flux of human feeling into a stable datum. Exactly. Azra's voice took on the casual cruelty of a deity explaining the laws of physics. And then there is the other small cost. Sometimes the affidavit insists on an offering. Paperclips are ideal. Or biscuits. Sentimentalities can be used as currency. Do you have something you'd be willing to give that is meaningful and not merely symbolic? Writer's face primed into a practical knot. We have the union's negotiating budget and, more importantly, the will to starve a bylaw into compliance. But I would not bind a person's memory to a signature for the sake of a paperclip. Nor would I, Arya said. But if it buys a hearing with someone very important, it will be worth it, Norman said. He surprised himself again by how calm that sentence sounded. If binding one memory can get that person's signature, if it can make them listen, then we should consider it. We are not preserving a sanitized version of things. We're trying to protect the possibility of being imperfect. Tom watched Norman and then set the little notebook down with a soft, decisive action. I will give testimony. I will show what I did. I will accept whatever consequence comes from speaking the truth. I will not ask you to bind my memory. I will instead stand and answer questions. And if they brand you as a precedent for all redactions, Arya asked, then I will stand there and say I was wrong, Tom said. Do you need something more than that? Yes, Rita said, we need witnesses. We need people who will tell not only of Tom's confession but of the ways that, in the small human scale, his suppression caused harm. We need midwives, teachers, the people whose lives became crooked because they had no forewarning. We need an argument that cannot be reduced to sentiment. You can find those people, Norman murmured, and for once it was not only anxiety speaking. He had mapped the world's small kindnesses in his head for years. His marginalia were full of them. He knew the names of midwives in towns that yearned to be recorded. He knew a teacher who had adjusted a curriculum because an unexplained hush had settled in her classroom. He knew, in other words, how to place a human anecdote in the middle of policy and make it look like evidence. We will need to act fast, Gideon said. The audit is still scheduled. A public hearing is only weeks away. If the directorate moves to lock the protocol, our window narrows. Then we will begin collecting testimony now, Rita said. We start locally, people on the ground. Then we add witnesses of standing, community leaders, someone from outside the department, and if possible, she paused, eyes on Azra, someone very important. At the invocation of that name, the basement seemed to tilt as if the ceiling itself had ears. Someone very important had an office that smelled of British biscuits and a disinclination for unsolicited paperwork. Someone very important liked precedent precisely because it kept inconvenient visitors away. Convincing them to sign would require not only argument but artifice, a demonstration of irrefutable human worth. Then we make the worth irrefutable, Norman said, feeling the word settle into his ribs like a stubborn, necessary thing. He imagined a midwife holding a baby and saying, "We improvised," and then the baby having a small birthmark shaped like a comma. He imagined a town showing up in a daisy chain of people and saying, "We were here, and we were messy, and we mattered." He imagined, improbably, a world in which forms acknowledged the ugly edges of being alive. Outside, somewhere far off and certainly at a distance that felt both mathematically precise and morally suspicious, a clock hiccuped. The hiccup was small but patient, and it sounded like a teapot trying to get back to boiling. They set to work. Gideon prepared lists. Rita drafted an outreach plan. Enoch promised a list of names he had never spoken aloud in public. Clara started baking. Arya watered the memos, as if taking care of them would make them less dangerous. Tom collected the names of those whose lives his redaction had touched. Norman, with a tiny stapler in his breast pocket like an amulet, began writing the first of the testimonials in a script so ordinary it felt heroic. Late that night, when the archives lamp threw long, private shadows and Norman's handwriting began to cramp, he looked at the team and felt something unfamiliar. Not belief that everything would be fixed, but a belief that they might be able to argue for a world in which broken things could be mended without erasing the people who broke them. It was a small courage, the kind that arrives on the edges of exhaustion. We are not erasing anything, he said to himself more than to anyone else. We are asking that our mess be recognized, Azra leaned over and tapped the page with a finger that left a trail like spilled glitter. "That is how you win with Primus," they said, "with stories that cannot be turned into statistics." Norman closed his notebook, the pages of testimony growing brown at the edges like leaves that promised to keep their shape through winter. They would try the affidavit, perhaps. They would gather witnesses. They would go to someone very important and present not a polished argument, but a pile of lives. And when they left the archive into a city hiccuping at the seams, Norman felt oddly steady. Where before he had been terrified that one misplaced stamp could flatten everything, he now believed that many small voices might ruffle the edges of the world and keep it breathing. Outside, the teapot finally stopped trying to be a clock and returned to the ordinary business of being slightly lukewarm. The hiccup in the world stuttered once, twice. They had work to do. As they filed up the archive stairs, Tom tucked his small notebook into his jacket like a man returning an old debt. Right as binder clacked, Clara offered Norman another biscuit and a look that said, "Without words, we will make it messily right." Aria's red pen clipped a memo to her lapel with a motion that suggested she might, just possibly, loosen a line in the margin. Meh. Enoch put his mop over his shoulder and hummed something that could have been an old lullaby or a scheduling chant. Azra blew confetti from between their fingers that dissolved on contact, much like an ill-advised amendment. They were not sure yet if anyone would listen. They did not know what price the affidavit might demand, nor how hard Primus would push to keep precedent unbroken. They did not know whether Tom's confession would be enough to persuade, or whether it would only be catalogued and boxed. They knew only that they would attempt to gather witnesses, rather than erase the trace. Norman felt the modest, specific courage of a clerk who had finally stopped trying to make everything align and started, instead, to make a case for the uneven, wonderful way humans persisted. On the way out, Gideon paused and turned back to the ledger, placing a thin, careful bookmark where the amendment had been found. "For future reference," he said. "Please name it something sensible," Clara replied, meaning please do not let this be lost. "Call it the margin clause," Gideon said, and Norman liked the name because it suggested what it was, a small, stubborn space where things that did not fit official categories might find a home. They stepped into an evening that smelled of postponed rain and old streetlights. The sky was a tidy bureaucracy of stars, each one having been there a long time and not interested in forms, but enjoying the odd human spectacle below. Norman tightened his coat, slipped his stapler back into his pocket, and walked toward the first of the people he would call. He had a list, a plan, and a suddenly urgent, messy faith. The chapter closed not with resolution, but with a plan forming like a new footnote in a ledger, the sort of footnote that begins, "It was argued," and refuses to finish without someone willing to stand and be counted. The world hiccuped in the distance, like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. They would gather testimony. They would not, Norman decided, allow the tidy erasure of those who had already lived wrongfully small. They would bring the messy truth to someone very important and, if necessary, make a world where imperfect love and imperfect courage had voice in the halls of ultimate authority. The archive's lamp flicked. Somewhere a page turned. The next chapter of their argument, and of their lives, was about to be written. The memo arrived like a polite cold front. One moment the Department of Catastrophes was its usual temperature, a slow, steady bureaucratic hum punctuated by the tea kettle's despondent whistles and the soft scratching of marginalia, and the next a stamped envelope the size of a small moon slid across Area Vost's desk and unfolded itself into the workspace with the kind of crispness usually reserved for coronations and expulsion notices. It was not the envelope itself that upset people so much as its contents. The header read, "Notice of Audit External Review Board," with a subheading in an even more worrying font, "Consideration for Public-Private Partnership Finality Services." If a sentence could wear a suit, this one did. It had been tailored in a manner that implied efficiency and profit, and the department, which had never before received a sentence that implied profit, recoiled as if from a very bright insect. Norman read it twice. On the first pass, the words skated across him like a bewildering foreign film. On the second, a certain arithmetic in his chest started to tick louder than usual. Privatize endings. Would a private contractor be likely to subcontract a small, dignified apocalypse to an offshore firm? Would there be performance metrics? Would the inevitable happen on schedule, but with delightfully improved branding? The potential for terrible pie charts was endless. Aria's face, usually the color of a well-inked form, narrowed into something that could have been anger if she had any energy left to conjure fury in forms other than policy. She picked up her red pen and, as a gesture of ancient comfort, tapped it once against the headline. The noise made Norman feel like he had been given a cue in a play he did not know the role of. The auditors arrived 3 days later in the kind of convoy that made the department's modest reception feel like a child's playroom newly invaded by very deliberate toys. They wore tasteful charcoal suits, shoes that suggested a quarterly report could be filed at any moment, and lapel pins shaped like tiny graphs. Their smiles were those of people who lived for margins. Their lead, a woman who introduced herself as Memes, Halberd, breathed synergy into the room the way some clerks breathed photocopy toner. She spoke of metrics, benchmarks, and opportunity ecosystems as if she were describing a very promising box of stationery. The words themselves were elegantly cruel. We simply wish to explore whether the management of finality might be improved with private sector innovation, she said, smiling in a way that suggested she had already written a press release for how beautifully humane such an innovation would be. Efficiency metrics could be applied, and scalable models could ensure consistent, reliable endings with optimized resource allocation. Silence answered her. The silence had the texture of paper left in a rainstorm. Rita K. Finch, who had arrived in the department carrying a binder full of grievances and a thermos of coffee that declared "Know your rights" in cheerful defiance, stood up as if moved by a single, righteous muscle. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice had the authority of union bylaws and a lifetime of organizing. "Are you proposing to auction the timing of people's deaths to the highest bidder?" Mies Halberd blinked, and for a moment the carefully composed executive smile faltered. "We are talking about models of service delivery," she said, "value-driven partnerships, outcomes-based solutions." Writer's binder seemed to swell as if with indignation. "You cannot market calamity," she said. "You cannot commodify the conditions under which human beings keep breathing. There is precedent here, and it involves ethics, law," and she glanced at Norman with a conspiratorial softness. "Basic decency." The room smelled of stale coffee and printer toner and something else, a metallic tang of fear that the department had not budgeted for. Meeting rooms were called. Policy memos, which usually provided the equivalent of bureaucratic warm blankets, now sat open on tables like cryptic maps. Norman found himself being pulled into a nexus of small, urgent meetings, Gideon hunched over a folding laptop, fingers moving with the speed and desperation of a man who suddenly knew his logs could be the difference between policy and pandemonium. Tom chalked out a diagram of how precedent metastasized into statute with the sideways grin of someone amused at a practical joke fate had played on them. Aria moved between them like a conductor who had only recently been handed the wrong score. "Privatization," Gideon said finally, as if the word itself had gears that could be turned. "If they win the audit and recommend P3 contracting, finality becomes a line item on a balance sheet. We lose discretion. Someone signs off in a boardroom, and human contexts are treated as variables in an equation." His voice was a quiet thing. "Someone had once told him that shouting broke servers. We can stall them," Rita said. "We delay. We force a review. We use worker protections. We make it administratively costly." Her eyes glittered like safety pins. "Delay is risky," Aria countered. Every day the Armageddon protocol remains active increases the chance of irrevocable closure. We do two things at once: defend our jurisdiction and seek the revocation. Norman offered the sort of practical, small-minded suggestion he had always used to change the course of a filing day. We could present testimony, he said. Human testimony, stories, evidence of harm, something the auditors cannot reduce to an ROI. The words tasted of marginalia. He had to lean forward for them. Writer's eyes softened. Exactly. We need a human dossier, not just cold numbers. It was a scandalously old-fashioned tactic, people. But it had the advantage of being true. The other advantage was that stories stuck in auditors' heads the way a misprinted memo sticks to a shoe. The department's responses were a mixture of procedural elegance and improvisational courage. Gideon, who had long believed that metaphor should be kept out of code, turned his servers into an ark. In a locked room where humming drives kept time like heartbeats, he began to mirror reality logs across multiple redundant arrays. He muttered at the machines and at the way the code refused to understand metaphor. Azra, who enjoyed the anachronistic comfort of blinking lights, offered baked goods in exchange for faster write operations and, allegedly, whispered a few metaphysical tricks into the system's metadata. "Why are you talking to a router?" Gideon asked, not for the first time. Azra, perched on a stack of obsolete backup tapes like a small, iridescent gargoyle, responded with the kind of elliptical smile that implied she had seen the router's childhood. "They tell themselves stories too," she said. "Some machines believe in fates. It makes scheduling easier." Enoch, the janitor, performed his own quiet countermeasure. He began walking the corridors with a brass-headed mop that somehow hummed approval when union flyers were posted. His mop head, polished by unknown decades, reflected the photocopier's light in a way that seemed to scold corporate logos. When corporate auditors wandered into stairwells to admire the building's operational aesthetic, Enoch would offer them a towel with the offhandness of someone who knew how to clean up after cosmic mistakes. Rita summoned the union. She had a talent for gathering people the way other people gathered paper clips, carefully, with purpose, and in numbers just large enough to be administratively inconvenient. Clerks whose normal daily acts involved stamping received notes and cataloging dust now wore Save Our Sanctity badges. They chanted procedural slogans. Someone made a banner that read, in florid bureaucratic font, "Stop the auction of finality." Outside the department, the auditors held themselves with the polite confidence of candidates for a philanthropic award. They arrived with laptops flashing graphs that made the very idea of an apocalypse look like an opportunity matrix. Investors, who had been advised in no uncertain terms to invest in stable returns with existential hedging, began to murmur. An editorial appeared in a paper that insisted on analyzing apocalyptic timing with the same seriousness as a municipal budget. The idea wove itself into talking head scripts as if it were inevitable, the way tides are inevitable if you read enough marine charts. Norman found himself thrust into a role that did not suit his training. He had been trained to correct, to annotate, to apply stamps that reassured. He was not trained to speak on behalf of the living, but speak he did. Rita organized listening sessions where people who lived through near misses small towns, whose scheduled endings had been postponed by earlier clerical mercy, midwives who had improvised delivery in the dark when policy failed, a librarian who had once held a child while a town clock hiccuped into a 3-minute eternity, presented accounts like witness statements. Norman gathered them into dossiers that smelled faintly of ink and biscuits. His own testimony was spare and careful at first. He described the day when a regional hiccup had turned a harvest into an anachronistic festival, and how the persistence of an unscheduled parade had, by accident, saved a child who would otherwise not have been found. He told the auditors about the way workers stitched kindness into forms, a clerk who delayed a minor sealing because she suspected nobody understood the clause fully. a janitor who left a torch in a window so someone lost in the dark could find shelter. He spoke of things that cannot be quantified, the habit of small mercies, the insistence of people to be allowed to be messy and human. At first the auditors listened with the polite, professional perplexity of people hearing a dialect entirely new to their spreadsheets. Mies. Halberd noted such testimony down in a notebook whose pages had the cheerful opacity of corporate ephemera. Mitha. Galloway, a man introduced as an associate from third-party integration services, mulled the possibility that such testimony could be packaged as engagement metrics. Human stories could become an offering, he said, and the room tightened. But stories do not always submit to commodification. Witnesses spoke in a way that was raw and small, and therefore more difficult for the auditors to price. A retired school teacher described the day she taught children to tick clocks in class as a way to remember the passing of time after a regional hiccup had left hours looping badly. A midwife spoke of squeezing fists and nails and how a delay in a scheduled ending had allowed a child to be born. The auditors took notes. Investors in the lobby made calls. Rita, mercilessly practical, turned testimony into policy language on the spot. We can take these accounts and frame them as risk mitigation, she told Gideon in an aside. The way an organizer might barber an argument until it was sharp enough to cut through executive jargon. Gideon, wiping his hands and talking to a server rack as if it were a beloved but breakable thing, nodded. All of this turned the department into a theater of procedure and improvised humanity. Meetings were held in stairwells so the auditors' microphones would not pick up private testimony. Memos were drafted that read like manifestos. Someone stapled a small post-it to Memes, Halberd's laptop, that said, in Norman's handwriting, "Remember, people are not line items." The note disappeared before Mies. Halberd's next meeting, or so the rumor went, the directorate represented in human terms by Auditor Primus was watching. Primus was an institution made personal, a figure who had a face like a stamp and a posture like an editorial policy. When they finally spoke, they did so in a voice that made minutes feel like citadels of memory. Audits are necessary, Primus intoned one morning from the high seat of their existence. We examine for precedent, for protections against caprice. Private interests introduce variables we cannot fail to account for. But Primus also carried a fear older than any directorate memo. In their mind, there were stories of an early era when decisions made in the absence of procedural restraint had unleashed chaotic endings. The directorate existed because someone once had decided to end without the necessary forms. That memory hardened, and Primus adherence to rules had the compassion of someone who had seen boundaries hold back tidewater. Norman, who had lately found courage like an accidental pen in his pocket, took to standing outside Primus' office and writing down small marginalia that later became his brief. He reasoned, as a man who had taught himself the language of forms would, that the way to beat a system steeped in precedent was to provide new precedent. If they could show a weight of human testimony and compelling evidence that compassionate exceptions had saved lives, perhaps the directorate could be persuaded to permit a remedial exception. When Primus announced that a formal review panel would be convened, the department braced itself. The panel would determine whether a non-standard remedy could be applied in cases like the one they faced. It would also give Mies, Halberd and her investors a public stage to make the full case for partnership-based finality management. The stakes tilted from internal peril to public spectacle. Behind the scenes, the team worked. Tom chalked up diagrams that were alternately maddening and illuminating. Azra, when not sampling Gideon's server snacks, found ways to make improbable legal interpretations seem plausible by the sheer force of glimmering metaphor. Mizar! Enoch polished doors and corridors until they held the department's reflection like a promise. Gideon, who had always loved logs the way some people love stained glass, kept backing them up into formats that would be legible even to people who preferred legalese to human speech. Norman's testimony was rehearsed, then thrown away, then pared down to an earnest set of recollections. He imagined himself like a clerk at a counter, holding up for a busy public the small acts that could not be itemized. He thought of the child whose life had been altered by a postponed schedule, the midwife who had hustled a breath into the world, the janitor who had left a towel and a small, scalded light in a window. He focused on the ordinary, because ordinary was harder to make and roy from than the spectacular. Ordinary humanness had a stubborn way of being unprofitable. As the day of the formal hearings approached, the department felt like a grand old building getting ready for a dignitary. Curtains were adjusted, memos were ironed in figurative senses, and emergency biscuits were baked and placed that they might prove useful in calming witnesses or distracting auditors. The teapot boiled with a determination that could be interpreted as either hope or a very good caffeine plan. Norman's hands trembled fewer times than he expected. His marginalia grew confident, and his tiny stapler received the kind of grateful looks usually reserved for relics. Outside, the building felt the world holding its breath. Investors finalized decks, editorial writers sharpened their metaphors. A television crew questioned whether privatizing finality might create a market for meaning, a phrase which, when spoken aloud, made even the department's copy machine hiss in a worried tone. In the quiet before the hearing, Rita clasped Norman's shoulder. "This is our shot at precedent," she said. "Not the kind Primus fears, but the kind that says procedure can have a heart." Norman looked at his ink-stained fingers and at the stack of testimonies, each a small human thing. "I will speak," he said. "I'll tell them about the things they can't put in their margins." And when the hearing opened, with Auditor Primus presiding like a very solemn stamp, the department would discover whether stories could stand where symposiums once did, whether a tepid teapot and a janitor's mop could stand against a suit spreadsheet, whether a collection of messy, human testimonies could tip an institution whose bones were made of precedent. The panel convened with the solemn rituals of a cathedral whose hymns were footnotes. The auditors smiled, mise. Halberd cleaned her glasses with the exactness of someone who believed clear optics meant clear outcomes. Investors adjusted their ties. Norman gripped his testimony like a lifeline. The air smelled faintly of burnt toast and possibility. When Norman spoke, he did not invoke long statutes or footnotes. He talked about a schoolteacher whose improvised lesson on time had taught children to notice their own hours. He spoke of a midwife, digits raw from a long night, who muttered a prayer that may or may not have been a lost procedural manual. He spoke of how an office that devoted itself to endings had, through small humane acts, kept beginnings alive. Against the hum of the room's administrative rituals, his words landed like very small, deliberate stamps. The room listened. Even Primus, whose face was a stamp and whose instincts were to stamp, seemed to press back for a moment and consider the margins. The panel would not decide that day. It was too early for such firm pronouncements. But Primus did something they had not done in many manned meetings. They announced a public review and, for the first time, invited testimony to be considered as part of the standard of reason that governed remedial exceptions. It was not a victory, it was, however, a door. A narrow, bureaucratically defensible door with a brass handle that would need some convincing to open wider, but a door nonetheless. As the auditors filed out, their graphs and their big, capital plans folded back into their briefcases, the department breathed as if recovering from a short but emphatic gale. Norman felt light-headed in the way someone feels after climbing a ladder and looking down dizzy with the sudden height of possibility. The memo that started the storm lay on Aria's desk, face down like a sleeping animal. And in the margins, where Norman's handwriting lived, the future added another marginality of its own, the beginning of a precedent. It would require work forms, filings, and more human testimony than anyone could imagine, but it had been set. In an institution built to schedule ends, an opening had been found, and it smelled faintly of biscuits. The audit loomed. so did hope. The hearing had set the clock. The directorate had opened the book, and the department now had to write its defense in a hand the auditors could not simply relegate to appendices. Norman returned to his desk with a new marginalia habit, a small scrap of paper that read, in his careful script, "People before precedent." He tucked it where his tiny stapler could see it, and the stapler, for reasons Norman would never fully explain, clicked contentedly. Outside, investors recalibrated their strategies. Inside, the staff prepared, the teapot boiled. The world, which had been hiccuping in small, comedic ways, seemed to draw a breath and wait, as if eager to see whether the people charged with endings could, in the end, save beginnings. And when the panel reconvened, Norman and his colleagues would have to present evidence again. But now, their testimonies had an audience and a legitimacy they lacked before. They had bought themselves time, and time in a department of catastrophes is the most valuable commodity of all. It allows for mistakes to be admitted, for mercy to be argued in footnotes, and for marginalia to become policy. The audit loomed. The department prepared. The world continued its small, steady, strange hums. And in a tiny corner of a very dull office, a clerk with ink-stained fingers tucked a marginal note beneath his stapler and smiled at the small impossibility that bureaucrats might be brave. The formal review panel would soon demand witnesses, verifiable evidence, and a demonstration that compassionate exceptions were not risks but protections. Norman's courage would be measured against precedent. The directorate's fear of the ad hoc would be measured against the weight of human testimonies. The auditors in their stylish suits would attempt, with numbers and models, to make the argument that endings could be made efficient and profitable. But efficiency, Norman thought as he folded another testimonial into the dossier, rarely accounts for the shape of a child's laugh. He made a note in the margin, and for the first time left his handwriting unafraid. The Department of Catastrophes, having been threatened with sale to the highest bidder, prepared to defend not just its authority, but the immeasurable, inconvenient value of being human. And somewhere, in a small server room and on a brass-handled mop, and in the tepid kettle's slow whistle, allies marshaled themselves into the peculiar kind of readiness that only bureaucracy and affection can produce. The audit loomed, yes, but so did a very particular and oddly stubborn human protest, the insistence that some things, even if scheduled, should never be optimized away.